Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to our Zoom sessions for 2021. It's great to be back. Welcome, of course, to all our regulars, and a special welcome to any new people who have joined us this week. My name is Alan Friedman. I'm Vice President of the Australian Jewish Association, and I'm the MC for the evening. And also visible on your screens are David Adler, President of the AJA, as well as our guest for tonight, Senator Alex Antic, who we will introduce in a moment. And of course, the topic tonight is the power of big tech and what can the government do about it. Our format will be as before. We will chat with Alex for about 30 minutes, at which point we will open up for questions from the audience. So as I always mention, if you do want to ask a question, the best way to indicate this is to send a signal by clicking on the participants icon down at the bottom and then on the raise hand or even the green tick icon. That sends a signal to us that you want to ask a question, and it's easy for us to keep track. As usual, the chat function is available for general comments, so feel free to send messages to the audience during the discussion. And as David mentioned, everybody has been muted for now to prevent those annoying noises during the first part of the session, but people will be able to unmute themselves once we get to question time. So with that, I'll hand over to David for the introduction and then to start the discussion.
Okay, well, thank you, Alan. Senator Alex Antic is regarded as one of the bright up-and-coming stars in our parliament. He and I were both speakers at the recent CPAC Australia conference, and he made a very positive impression, particularly in his discussion with Alan Jones. And one of the things that arose there, and it wasn't such a big issue as it is now, is that he was interested in looking at the power of big tech, the way that Facebook and Twitter, Google perhaps, YouTube and others were behaving. And of course, in the last few weeks, it's become an enormous issue internationally, particularly with the censoring and deplatforming of President Trump, as well as a whole range of other conservatives. And many of us here have had some experience with different types of censoring. So Alex, welcome to the AJA event. And I'd like to begin by asking you why you've latched onto this issue, why you think it's an important priority issue.
Well, thanks, David, and thanks, Alan, and thanks everyone for being here. I guess it's it's a growing issue. It's been an issue that's been a personal topic of interest of mine for many years. As you said, I'm a relative newcomer to Parliament. I'm 18 months into first term, hopefully. I think when you come into this environment, you sometimes bring a backlog of issues that you think are important. We're very privileged, of course, and lucky in the upper house that we do get an opportunity to explore these issues. I guess to a certain extent, this bells the cat a little bit on my viewing preferences, because it's been an issue that many of my favourite commentators, Ben Shapiro and a few others on YouTube have talked about for years. And I was always intrigued by the concept because I never really considered myself high tech, and that that may shock you, but getting your head around some of these concepts is very interesting. But these companies and their growth and the potential that comes with that growth, I think, is the thing that really triggered my interest at first. Now, we're now talking about companies that are no longer startups, and I think it's only in the last 2 decades, which has really travelled very quickly. But we're talking about companies which, as a result of the internet-driven technology revolution of the last few decades, have now become the biggest companies in the world. And we're talking about Google, of course, which has the most traffic of any websites in the world, and also directs the largest amount of internet traffic of any website in the world, followed by YouTube, which they say, and I still can't get my head around these figures, but they say there is 500 hours of content uploaded to YouTube per minute, which just strikes me as being staggering. Twitter, which has 1.3 billion users and something like 200 million per day, and Apple, which is the first $2 trillion company. I think it might have been the first $1 trillion company, but I'm happy to be corrected on that. So we've seen in a very short amount of time these feel-good stories, the Silicon Valley stories, where people, 1 minute seem to have been playing ping pong and sitting in beanbags, all of a sudden going from these sort of feel-good stories to becoming companies of enormous influence overnight. We've never really known what the backstory to that is, what the ethos of some of the people that control these companies are, and how that fits into the landscape. But they've gone from being, for example, in the case of YouTube, a facility which for the largest time in the last decade or 2 decades was used for silly things like funny cat videos or people uploading their video games, to controlling something like one of the largest shares of journalism anywhere in the world. Something like 4 out of 10 Americans now get their news from Facebook, according to a Pew Research study of a couple of years back. So the growth, I think, is the thing that really interested me, and also these series of complaints, if you will, particularly from conservative commentators, that they were being silenced. And we can come to some of the methods used that are quite interesting later on as well, if you like. But it's a growing area, and I think it's one that's really, really important to our democracy.
Alex, there's been some discussion as to whether these are passive platforms or whether they're actually publishers. I would have thought that in the last few weeks, that discussion has essentially been settled. But how do you see, are they platforms or publishers?
I think that's another of that sort of comes from the growth pattern as well. We've seen, and I've seen them described sometimes, or an analogy drawn to the railroads of the bygone era and the Wild West in the United States. In a sense that they were conduits rather than judged by what they're actually carrying, or even pipes that are sort of a carriage service, if you will. And that's been the debate. Are these platforms where effectively they give a mechanism for people to express views, publish material, or are they now publishers? And as you say, David, I think to a certain extent, some of these social media platforms, and we are talking about social media platforms in addition to some of the other big tech outlets like Google and Apple, which are a little bit different. But I think they really now have to be considered, in my view, to be publishers. And once again, this is the law catching up with the business model, and the debate, and I'm not sure if you've been following it, but the debate in the US around Section 230 of the Communications and Decency Act very much summarises that point. These companies have been relying on the protection that's afforded to them by that legislative instrument for a long period of time. It's not something that applies here. There's no equivalent in Australia, but it does give them cover fire from being judged as a publisher. So as it stands under American law at the moment, platforms like Facebook can't be, under the normal circumstances, held accountable for defamatory conduct that's put on there. The person who publishes it is the publisher in round terms. So it's a very interesting debate, and I think actually that's the one that goes to the heart of the issue and the real challenge for regulators and governments all over the world. But look, from where I'm sitting, I think they've transcended platforms personally.
Yeah, and we see that certain issues are dealt with in different ways. We have all seen these so-called fact check screens that are put on certain types of information if you want to argue one side of the climate change argument versus another, that it'll be treated differently. I'm actually going to drill down to a couple of specifics, and I'll show you and the people that are here some examples of AJA messages that have been affected, and invite your comment. I've screen shared a picture which was taken from our YouTube list recently. And you can see that of these few videos, on the 8th of January, just a few days ago, a video that we put up of Kamala Harris talking about Black Lives Matter riots. And this is the famous video where she said that they will continue and they should continue. This was removed for some copyright claim, apparently, when it's widely available across many platforms. Then we have this other one, which was Trump telling his supporters to go home. This is after the invasion of Capitol Hill, and it was just a 1 minute video, as you can see, 1 minute and 5 seconds there, and it was removed because apparently showing Donald Trump saying that his supporters should be peaceful and go home breaches YouTube guidelines, and our video on this was removed. So they're just two examples of videos.
Yeah.
Now I'll see if I'll show you one more. It'll just take me a moment to get to it. But there's another technique which is used, which some people refer to as shadow bans. Now, what is a shadow ban? It's the mysterious algorithms. So late last year, we put up an item. There was a person in Melbourne who was arrested for providing funds to terrorist organisations. And we ended up putting up two identical posts. This first one was done by me on the AJA page, and you can see here it reached only 300 odd people and almost no engagement. We did an identical post a couple of hours later because I thought, this is funny. This is not reaching our audience. But this time I logged in using a friend's login and behind a VPN, and it got over 10 times the exposure of the earlier post, which was identical. So you told me that your own experience, that if you put out a message that might have the word Trump in it, you've had this. So is this what we're talking about?
Look, you've summarised it very well there. I think that was very helpful to see it graphically represented there as well. There are generally, I think, three or four main ways in which we talk about this kind of censorship. And once again, I mean, this is a huge topic. So we could talk about the concept of cancel culture in an entirely different, setting. We could talk about,
Sure.
these big tech companies and privacy concerns in another one. But the concept of censorship in itself, when it's relating to social media companies, seems to relate to three main areas. The first one is the one you've just described, which is shadow banning. Now, I think from where I sit, that's probably the most interesting of all of them, because we really don't know how that actually plays out. Sometimes even if it's real, I mean, there have been times where the Twitter CEO, I think, has actually even said, oh, we don't censor things due to political content, which is presumably why it is that your examples there relate to copyright infringements rather than we just don't like the President of the United States. That is the intriguing one, because what is suspected to be happening is that whatever algorithm it is that they're using hides it, pushes it to the side. Often, people complain, certainly commentators in the United States have been complaining for many years about people not being able to find their videos. Dennis Prager, of course, from PragerU, is a famous complainant about that particular issue. They have a range of what, to me, perhaps it's indicative of my politics, but it seemed like quite benign issues and very informative, very entertaining videos, which seemingly fall afoul of YouTube's rules. So they seem to get buried somewhere in the algorithm, a bit like you've been describing there. I've experienced it. I mean, once again, these are anecdotal examples, but it seems every time that I referred to President Trump, be it favourably or otherwise, my normal statistics on Facebook would tank, and it's consistent. There's a seemingly consistent pattern. Now, there's always, I think, a danger associated with anecdotal, evidence like that. But this is the reason why I want to get a select committee up and running, because that's a very powerful instrument. We'll talk about that later on. But Parliament's ability to drill into some of these issues, to issue subpoenas and the similar mechanism, and to effectively cross-examine some of these CEOs about these practices, I think is going to be really, really informative if it can get up, because we don't know. A lot of this stuff is strictly in the hands of the provider. And of course, we've talked about the concept of shadow banning, but we've also got other mechanisms used as well, like deplatforming, which has been a topic that's been very relevant of late, and in fact has happened to the president being completely banned from Twitter forever and removed. And it's a tactic that's been used, so the saying says, through the university system that some of these up and coming executives have been through, taking people off the free speaking circuit on the United States, some of their colleges and universities, and now having adapted that and worked that into the rules of some of these organisations. So you can see the Marxist tendencies rolling in, and they seem to have come from the university sector into the private sector and now into big tech world. And it's really concerning, given the amount of power we're seeing in these companies. They are significant holders of power, and I don't think we've ever seen a time when so much influence is shared by so few, in a sense. And just, if I can just tack one thing onto the end there, I think probably the premier example of how powerful and influential this can be is the Hunter Biden story, which was,
right.
If we remember, the story related to his laptop, which was cast several weeks before the US election, and I think the New York Post ran the story, and then Facebook and Twitter effectively just buried it. And Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter, apologised for it 2 weeks later. Can't remember the exact reason for it, but it just goes to show how these stories can, first of all, be sidelined, shadow banned, as you say, and also then have a clear and present influence on our democratic system. So it's an enormous issue as far as I can see.
There have been a couple of initiatives which have tried to provide alternatives. I guess one that was fairly high profile was Parler.
Yeah.
And then their business model got deplatformed as well.
Yeah.
There seemed to be a conspiracy that pulled them down. They're trying to get back up. I'm not advocating for Parler one way or another, but I know a couple of people that have gone on to it, and then all of a sudden the service disappeared.
Well, I mean, it speaks to the issue of the other, the cartel behaviour potentially. I mean, it seems to be that, look, prima facie, it seems to be that you've got one company sort of protecting another through a different mechanism. Apple protecting Twitter, presumably, and once again, there's another whole topic there, and then we'll come to this later on. But this issue about they're private companies, they can do what they like, and I think that that speaks to that. So we'll come to that perhaps, if you like, later on.
Okay. Well, you have said when you made your announcement that you're going to propose a Senate Select Committee, that it shouldn't be big tech that are the arbiters of our free speech. What sort of reaction have you got from your colleagues? Do you think there's a chance of this inquiry getting up?
Look, it's an interesting question, because I actually canvassed this in a fairly informal manner prior to the break. Prior to this becoming an issue, probably not long after we spoke about it, I started the process of sort of speaking to colleagues about it, about where they all sat on it. The general view, I think, on the coalition side, I think, is that there is a great deal of understanding about the challenges associated with some of the things we've been talking about. So, look, I'm hopeful there is support there. I'll be moving it notwithstanding, of course, but I am really hopeful. I think that there is an understanding, and some of the things, of course, that the government's been doing, which are similar but different in terms of the ACCC bargaining code, the media bargaining code it's not this issue, but it picks up a few of the threads of some of the issues. And for everyone listening there, I'm sure people are aware of it, but in April of last year, the government asked the ACCC to put together a draft code allowing some of the legacy media outlets to effectively bargain with the big tech companies, Google, Facebook, for payment for their story and their content, which strikes me as being eminently reasonable. But of course, Facebook and others have kicked back, suggesting they'll leave, etc., and so on. So, look, I think to cut that into a short answer from a long answer, where I think I was headed, I think there is certainly an appetite to look at this. And as I said, I mean, I'm absolutely resolute about this. This is an issue which, is a worldwide issue, a very challenging one, and needs a genuine deep dive, I think.
Well, for what it's worth, Alex, we would certainly support the establishment of such an inquiry, and we would make a submission. There are a couple of specialist issues which we would seek to raise. We see an anti-Israel bias in some of the social media, and there have been some organisations that have demonstrated that. I won't go into the detail, but also the anti-Semitism issue. If there's going to be a code, it's one that we would raise as well. Twitter was nailed in a committee of the Knesset a couple of months ago when they were asked about their inconsistency. Okay, if you're preventing the advocacy of violence, how come Ayatollah Khomeini is allowed to advocate for our entire genocide? And the way they fluffed around, so some of those issues exist for us in the background.
Yeah, that's right.
So look, how do you respond to the private company excuse? You know, these are private companies, they're not arms of government, therefore they should be able to set their own ways of operating, and, you know, it's optional. You know, you can opt into having a Facebook account or you can opt out.
Yeah, look, I mean, that comes up a lot, and I mean, I'm, you know, as always, you know, great advocate for the market sorting these things out. I genuinely believe that. I think part of the problem we see now, though, is going back to the example you talked about earlier about Parler, and it almost highlights the issue that I think this has developed so rapidly and so quickly, and these companies have become so big and so you know, difficult to manage in many respects, you know, from some of these themes, that there almost needs to be a regulatory step. And we have seen that with private companies before. I mean, companies are not just, you know, unregulated wastelands of, you know, free anything. I mean, you know, even the concept of freedom of speech, there are limits. And in the same way, there are limits on corporations for all things. Now, ultimately, regulation, in my mind, you know, comfortable with that being put at a limit. But, you know, we've seen, you know, media ownership laws before, which go back many, many decades, which have tweaked what can and can't be done. We've seen, you know, the Australian print media code, I think it is, which deals with, you know, sort of a regulatory framework for the print media. ACMA, who deal with the media. So there are regulatory frameworks that can be put into place, and we have done so. I don't see this as being any different. You know, it would be great to be in a world where it's, you know, there's a laissez-faire approach and corporations just go on their merry way. But I don't think that's being very realistic. I saw a, you know, as always in 2020, 2021, the meme is the thing that sort of captures the attention and sums it up. And of course, many will be familiar with the site Babylon Bee, the satire parody site, and they had one 2 days ago, which was a scene from Terminator 2, the movie, you know, where Skynet takes over, and it's a person getting stepped on by a robot, and he's saying down the bottom, oh, well, it's a private company, they can do what they like. Mm-hmm. And it sort of sums up the issue. You know, I mean, corporations can't run away on their own entirely. What that regulatory framework looks like, the various options that are available, I don't know. There are some examples from overseas which are interesting, but that's sort of the purpose of the select committee in itself, is to explore these things, make recommendations, and see what works, because what might work, say, in Poland may not necessarily work in Australia, and, you know, vice versa. So it's a very, very complicated arrangement, particularly with the transnational portion of it.
There is a member of the National Party who's been quite outspoken on this, George Christensen. You've probably seen some of his comments, and he's got a petition running at the moment. I'm not a fan of these sort of petitions, but it's there if anyone's interested. But he did make what I thought was an interesting comment. I'd like your reaction. He basically said that something which is legal in Australia should not be censored. Yeah. Now, we don't support the advocacy of violence, harming a person or property, but we do allow, in a democracy, supposedly, a breadth of opinion. If you're going to have a debate, an argument, people with different opinions, then almost by definition, someone is going to hold an opinion which is incorrect. The debate will be held, and maybe the correct opinion will overcome the incorrect one, or maybe it won't. So what's your reaction to the proposition that provided it's not illegal in Australia, it should be censored? It should not be censored.
Yeah, it's I mean, I think a very clear way of saying what, in fact, Poland have done, coming back to that point, in the last 2 or 3 weeks, the Polish Parliament apparently have passed a bill post New Year, which effectively does that, and that's perhaps where George got the idea from. Anything that's not in breach of the Polish law, so that would be whatever, sedition, threats of murder, violence, whatever, can be removed from social media platforms. But anything that's just an opinion, a political opinion, if that's removed, it attracts a serious fine. I think they're talking about $2 million Australian or that sort of thing. Strikes me as being pretty sensible. It also strikes me as being simplistic. I think you're absolutely right though about the issue of the limits, and the concept of freedom of speech is a very interesting and detailed one. I'm with you. I have no tolerance for threats of violence or emotional distress or bullying and those sorts of things. But that is also used as a pretty effective Trojan horse or a shield by some of these companies. Everything that is removed in many cases is just referred to as hate speak, or the current crop of buzzwords are misinformation and disinformation, which seem to be the current catch cry. So it sort of comes back to that issue. We need a contest of ideas. We need people to be able to thrash ideas out. That's what an open and free society does. And we need to be careful with who we give the keys to being the arbiters of freedom of speech. It's not, in my mind, it's not for Twitter, it's not for Facebook, it's not for Parler or Gab or any of these sites to determine who gets the microphone. And that is a very challenging thing to do. The Polish approach is a very good one. George's suggestion is a good one, but once again, this is the point of the select committee. What works for Australia? And that'll be the interesting facet of the whole argument.
So even if someone holds a view that's incorrect, and I'll give you a very simplistic one. If I was to say the Earth is flat, okay, 99.999% of people would say that's rubbish.
Yep.
But if I wanted to draw a diagram and say, look, here's a picture of a flat Earth, should I be allowed to do it?
Yeah.
It's.
Well, I mean, once again, coming back to the concept of the free market, I would say that your summation of the Earth being flat would get derided, if that is a word, very quickly, and the court of public opinion would dismiss it. I mean, I think in those circumstances, that's the way I'd see it. I think that's the way the contest of ideas works. Yeah. So, yeah, it's an interesting debate.
Okay, well, Alan, we're reaching the halfway mark, so
okay.
I think we've set the scene and invite questions.
Thanks, David. Now I've got Dennis with his hand up. So everybody, if you've got any questions brewing, now's the time to consolidate them and let us know. Just before we go to a couple of questions, Alex, I just wanted to ask you one myself. In our system of a liberal democracy, censorship is regarded as a bad thing. We value freedom of speech. And in fact, the Americans have gone so far to enshrine it in their constitution. So what would stop a government simply passing some laws saying, look, censorship is not part of our philosophy. It's not part of this country's philosophy. We're going to institute some laws that make it impossible or difficult for outside private organisations to censor what people say. Is that doable?
Well, I mean, the point you make is that inalienable right, as the Americans call it, is lodged in their constitution. Now, it's not in ours. There is a limited portion, I think, thinking back to my days of constitutional law, a limited section in the constitution which deals with political free speech, but it's a concept, as I recall it, which comes from the common law and then from statute as well. So I think in our system, what we find is needing to legislate on individual issues like this one. I'm not aware of a mechanism where the government could simply, throw a broad brush, censorship, freedom of speech, legislative instrument that wouldn't require a mechanism of the constitutional amendment. But there may well be lawyers in amongst the crowd that could field that one better than I could. But I think this is part of the problem, and it comes back to some of these issues with the various discrimination bills as well. What we find in our system is, be it religious discrimination or some of the human rights discrimination acts, they almost have to be done individually in order to protect that right or shield the right. So I see this as being sort of, similar in a sense that really what we would be doing is regulating the framework of the media organisations and the sort of social media companies, rather than some broad blanket approach, which I think would be a very, very big undertaking. It's my way of thinking anyway.
Okay, right, so I've got Dennis, Ruven, Brian, I think you had your hand. Oh, you did. So I've got Dennis, Ruven and Brian. Anybody else? Now's the time to frame a question and let us know. So Dennis, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you for speaking to us today, Senator. I appreciate it. The most virulent anti-Semitic site on the internet that I have discovered is something called JewWatch. It contains many, many links to most defamatory and ill-conceived ideas and anti-Semitic ideas about Jews. If I go to Google, once upon a time last year, it came up as the first or second item if I put in Jew.
Yeah.
It doesn't anymore, and if I put in JewWatch on Google, it is now buried somewhere around page 5 of the searches. If I go to Microsoft Edge, it is the second item that comes up. I have it open now. I want to know why, internationally and in Australia, the most commonly used search engine after Google, which is Microsoft Edge, which everyone gets when they buy a computer and install Microsoft software, why that is still allowed to be the case, and why I can click on all these terrible defamations which exist.
Well, it probably tells the story as we've been describing it, doesn't it? I mean, that stuff falls squarely into the category of things that really need to be blanketed by social media companies and big tech. And I think what you're saying there is that Google, perhaps to their credit, have done some work in terms of pushing it down the ranks at least. Here in Australia, of course, we've got the Office of the e-Safety Commissioner, and those sorts of complaints can be made about various sites, but they're always offshore, and enforcing them is almost impossible in my understanding. So it's sort of one of those areas which highlights the difficulty with what we're talking about, because that's a very genuine issue to be perhaps buried or taken off screens, and comes back to the very heart of genuine hate speak, genuine hate speak, rather than political censorship as it's sometimes used. There are lots of examples, I think, where this sort of, different approach to what gets censored comes up. We've seen a couple of examples. I mean, the classic has been the last few weeks with the president getting banned, but the Ayatollah in Iran keeping his Twitter feed, or the other one was, there was a rapper whose name I forget, who was walking around Seattle in a sort of a fiefdom of his own, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, he was calling it, who was tweeting from this lawless little section of Seattle. So, the answer to why these things get buried differently or treated differently by different companies, that is part of the problem. I mean, I think that's the approach that's used by different companies for the same content, I think, is a very real question, and something that needs to be explored once again, and would be explored as part of this committee, I think, because there need to be some sort of standards in terms of how we deal with these, and to the extent they can be uniform, I think that's a really important thing.
Okay, Ruven, please unmute yourself.
Hi, Senator Alex. Thank you for speaking to us tonight. And my question is, I've noticed that sometimes I receive Facebook messages from organisations, reputable organisations, log it straight away, friends straight away, but then there are others from the same organisations that are delayed 1 or 2 days. So I'm opening why, they sent it 2 days ago. How come I'm just receiving it now? And I think, well, maybe they've been branded to be especially censored, and whether it's going to be published or not published. Any comment on that one?
Well, once again, I think this comes back to the issue of why we need to look into these practices. What, you know, as I've called it, I don't like the expression because it's very corporate speak, but a deep dive. You know, I think there are so many things that are happening. I mean, some of these little anecdotal points are very interesting. We probably all had the occasion where something we never talked about before. You know, I saw somebody do an experiment on this once, dog toys. They've never talked about dog toys. They've never had a dog. They don't know anything about dogs. None of their friends have got dogs, but they just decide they're going to start talking about dog toys. And all of a sudden, dog toy ads start appearing in their Google feed. We don't know why. Many instances they deny it, but we just don't know what these companies are doing. We don't know what they're doing with data. We don't know what they're doing with, you know, censorship and burying commentators, you know, burying the news feeds, changing their algorithms. So I mean, somebody knows the answers to these, and getting some of these people before a powerful Senate committee and asking these questions, I think it'd be really, really interesting. So we could hopefully get some answers.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, Brian, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you very much, Senator. It's more of a comment than a question. I wonder if the committee will be considering another category like Wiki and Snopes, who purport to be providing independent information. I've caught both of them out, but nobody to report to. The Wiki, I cancelled my annual donation to Wiki because I said I had received information from the Israel group that they are deliberately biased against Israel and anti-Semitic. They denied it to me and gave me the usual spiel. I then referenced them to the website with the names and the dates, and I got no reply. Yeah. And the same with Snopes. There was a particular issue, and I caught them out with a witness who showed that they were wrong, and they just did not reply. Now, this is not a question of opinion or defamation, etc. These are sites which purport to be providing independent, truthful information to the public at large, but they have agendas.
Yeah, I think it's a great observation, Brian. I'm always skeptical of some of these fact-checking sites. We've got some in Australia too, and you know, there's this sort of ability now to pitch, you know, checking on facts and this sort of post-truth, as they call it, post-truth world where, you know, your facts are different to my facts, they're different to somebody else's facts, and they're held out as truth. And look, I think there'd be many, many instances where things like that would come up. It does also tie back into this issue of transnational problems and, you know, extra-jurisdictional problems. If those companies were all Australian, they could, I mean, there would be a number of different legislative instruments under the, you know, the ACCC probably would have significant powers to check on those and to fine people. But once again, when you've got companies overseas, I think this is part of, once again, at the risk of coming back to it again, part of the problem we would face if we have a structure to look into these sorts of issues. And, you know, what do you do about them? And ultimately, with a draft bargaining code and Facebook with its head office overseas, you know, what does that mean when, you know, the Geelong advertiser wants to do a deal, or, you know, News Limited want to do a deal with Facebook for this part of this media bargaining code? I mean, you're dealing with overseas companies. It's a really tricky issue and a very complicated one at law, I think. So, but I've heard that frustration, particularly with a couple of those sites, many, many times, and there are many, many others too that do the same thing. The internet is so useful on one hand and so potentially difficult on another on all these levels. It's a continuing problem, I think.
Okay, Saul, please unmute yourself. Good.
Could I ask you this, and please don't take this in any way wrongly, Senator Antic. You say that there are reasons that people don't, there are things that people don't know, why these companies act in a certain way. Do you think that there are, in fact, people in government who actually do know why the companies act in a certain way and are aware of what is going on, but you are not, as a freshman, yet
I think there are many things that I'm not aware of that others in government do know. I'm sure about that. As to this, I'm not sure. I really don't know. I don't, you know, I think part of the problem with not knowing how they work is this sort of shadowy, you know, it almost leads itself into this sort of rabbit hole of conspiracy theories and all that sort of stuff. I'd be very surprised if anyone in government knew how these companies really act, knew what was really going on, every detail of all of that. So I don't think so. But I mean, who knows whether that's the case in different countries across the world. Here, I think the operations are, like many companies would have their private dealings. I don't think anyone really knows exactly how they operate, why they operate, and the sort of mechanisms they used. So I'd be very surprised if there was some extra knowledge. I mean, there probably some, but there was very much anyway. But
okay. If anybody's got a question, now's the time. While we're waiting, I'll ask you another one of mine, Alex.
Yeah.
Social media has grown so quickly, it really caught everybody off guard. And I think one of the things that happens when this occurs is there are unintended consequences. And I'm just thinking of one example where people applying for a job will now get scrutinised by employers, and if they don't like their political views, that can affect their prospects for employment. This is sort of getting quite sinister. Is this something that you feel should be addressed as well?
Well, I think, as we said earlier on, I mean, the topic itself is so broad. I mean, the activities of these companies in terms of privacy issues, which is probably more what we're talking about there, I mean, that's a whole different kettle of fish, as they say. I mean, you could go on and on about that. I mean, so the story goes, you know, people are very, very liberal, if you like, with what they post on Facebook and Twitter and so forth and so on. And I mean, I think that is actually going to be an increasing issue for people in the future. Parliamentarians of the future, I suspect, are all going to be able to shrug their shoulders and say, oh, well, you know, I was 18, I was, you know, having a few drinks and, you know, I fell over, or, you know, something like that. I think we're going to become more accepting of the information that's out there and more accepting of people having access to information about us, which we really didn't even 10 years ago. But once again, I think that sort of falls more into the privacy issue. People, of course, are volunteering some of this information, volunteering all sorts of information, you know, family photographs and, you know, and of course there's the whole issue of GPS tracking as well. These phones in our pocket would tell companies huge amounts of information. And I think there was a story in the paper the other week about the various social media companies and the information they take. This was, I think, in response to the changing of WhatsApp's recent terms of service. And I forget which outlet it was, but they did a complete summary of the various information that was collected, and the information that Facebook collect about us when we don't even know it is extraordinary. So these are all challenges that come up, and I think you're quite right. They come up because social media has grown so quickly, and many of us have just dived into it without really thinking about the future consequences and what we say. And politically, it's already had consequences with people. You know, we've had candidates getting in trouble for things they said 4 years ago sometimes. You know, so it's a real concern, I think.
Yeah, and do politicians worry that it's almost becoming impossible to be a normal human being and be a politician at the same time? And I just wonder whether this might actually discourage people from entering politics, which is the exact opposite of what we want.
I think it does. I think the point you make with politicians being normal human beings, that's debatable. But I think it does. I mean, it's just a new layer of scrutiny, isn't it? I mean, once upon a time, you know, I suppose the worst you had to worry about was minding your manners down at the local restaurant down the road. Now you're on show 24 hours a day, and I'm sure there are people, quite rightly, who would see that as an enormous disincentive to getting involved in public life. It's sort of a 24-hour-a-day job now.
Yeah.
But it's the world we live in. It's not going to change.
Yeah, well, I think, was it President Eisenhower who was in a wheelchair, and
that's right.
nobody, I mean, half the population didn't even know.
Didn't know. He would. I think he went on campaign trail in a train, didn't he? And I think he didn't get off the back of it or something like that.
Yes, that, yeah, times have changed.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a question from Gary. Please unmute yourself and fire away, Gary.
Yeah, I take part in the academic website called the Conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Extreme leftist in all its politics. They ban people, they censor loads of comments, and always under the banner of community standards,
Right.
which seems to be the get out clause for even the high tech platforms you're talking about.
Yeah.
Of this idea of community standards and censorship. I think that as the basis could be the point to look at.
Yeah, I think you're quite right, Gary. I mean, it sort of comes back to some of those buzzwords we used earlier: disinformation, misinformation. I forget the rest of them. Hate speak. You know, all in their truest sense are, you know, probably things, but they're often, I think, used as cover. I mean, one of the commentators that I follow made the observation earlier in the week that not a single Democrat has been censored on Twitter since in the same period that you know, a number of Republicans have been taken down. And I mean, that's sort of the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the hypocrisy, or the perceived hypocrisy, we'll call it, will be generous. I mean, the conservative side of the commentariat would say it's all them. The evidence seems to suggest and support that, I have to say. I mean, Kathy Griffin, who you remember, the comedian in the US who got in trouble for holding up Trump, you know, mannequin head, a week or two after the election, I think, did the same thing, and you know, her Twitter feed remains. And once again, coming back to the Ayatollah in Iran, who has tweeted out calls to destroy Israel, remains on there as well. You know, apart from a half a dozen other different you know, examples, they go on and on. So there is this double standard, and the mechanism that's used, because I think certainly the companies are judging from the CEO of Twitter, Jack Dorsey, and the words he's used before talking about, we don't censor for political grounds. I think the point you're making is sometimes it's easy to find convenient other grounds to do it, community standards being one of them. It seems like a get out of jail free card, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. Alex, it seems to me that if we want to affect some change here, we're going to need to get some fairly influential people involved. And I think Elon Musk has already said something. But what about somebody like Bill Gates? Now, I mean, he would carry more influence than just about anybody in the tech world. Could somehow these people be, you know, drafted to really drive the agenda? I mean, this is obviously an American thing. Yeah, but what do you think? I mean,
I think, look, I think as always, when the captains of industry talk, politicians listen, and there's no doubt about that. Once again, it comes back to that issue of this is stuff that's happening offshore, and so it's difficult from Australia's point of view to influence any of that. You know, I think we need to look at the sort of regulatory steps that we take here to control our own environment. I know that the Facebook have threatened to, I mean, I don't know how they will do this, but withdraw from Australia if this draft bargaining code goes through. So, I mean, we do have a lot of power in those legislative instruments. I think, as always, getting these powerful people to support it, it would be good. I'm not sure that the likes of Bill Gates, I just don't know what his position on this would be. You know, but you know, Elon Musk certainly has made comments, and I've seen people tweeting back at him, why don't you buy all of these companies, Elon, and fix it all? So that's another option. I mean, you could always try that. But I mean, as I've said before, I mean, without, you know, I joke about that, but even though at the moment it seems to be conservative commentators who are on the receiving end of this, the very point is that pendulum can swing at any time. And, you know, I mean, Elon Musk, who's perceived to be a more conservative libertarian voice, you know, somebody like that could theoretically take a controlling share of any of these companies and flip it back the other way. So that contest of ideas is really what we're looking for. We're not looking for a safe space for necessarily for conservative viewpoints. We're looking for a system where the ideas can be thrown backwards and forwards, because as Jack Dorsey says, these are genuinely now virtual town squares. You know, they really are. So they're very important.
Mm. The one that interested me, and you touched on it earlier, was Parler. And it just overnight they were just deplatformed.
Yeah.
And I would have thought that there would have been a huge outcry, but it's really come and gone, and now Parler just disappeared.
Yeah.
I mean, how do we explain that?
Well, that's a very interesting dynamic, and it comes back to this issue of big tech being more than just the social media companies. So there's a platform which you're all probably aware of called Gab. Now it gets labelled a sort of alt-right, far-right, platform. I don't really know. I don't really use either of them. But the point is that Gab, I think a year or two ago, might have even been more, had a similar experience where their hosting service, which was controlled by a bigger tech company, was simply the rug was pulled out from under them, and they were told they're not allowed to use that hosting service. And what they did was they went away and set up their own hosting service, which people that I know that are more across the tech side of it tell me is not a small task. Amazon were hosting Parler. They did the same thing. So in addition to being removed from the App Store and Google's Play Store, then Amazon jumped in on top of that in the greatest big tech pylon you've ever seen in your life and removed their hosting services as well. Comes back to that issue about the free market doing what it wants. Now that would be proof positive that the market forces haven't worked there, and in fact, a competitor which was gaining speed, was gaining followers, and was gaining users has been cancelled 3 times. So that's where you get into this realm of being able to justify regulatory influences, I think. I mean, that is a very troubling scenario, I think, and particularly when we're in the midst of this election, it's really shown some of these flaws up, I think, in the last month, probably.
Yes. If anybody wants to sneak a question in, now's the time. Alex, I wanted to ask you about Poland, because you've mentioned that a couple of times, and could you just remind us all what Poland did, please?
Yeah. So Poland have, I forget the actual name of the act, but Poland late last year introduced a bill into their parliament, which in essence makes it illegal for social media companies to remove content, posts, videos, whatever they may be, tweets, which deal with things that are lawful in that country. So when I say that, I mean an opinion rather than, I'm going to light a bomb and blow people up, which of course is not lawful, and that would be okay to be pulled down. But anything that's just something lawful in Poland is now, as I understand it, I think the act has passed, protected by that mechanism, and is required to be left on these services. So if Twitter were, for example, to take down a post where somebody, for whatever reason, just pronounced their love of the Sydney Swans, and that, for whatever reason, would normally get, grind Twitter's gears, and it's removed, then there's a fine associated with it, and it's a significant fine. And I think the interesting thing will be to see how these social media companies deal with that. They talk about pulling out of these jurisdictions, but will they really? I mean, I think what we're seeing is the legislative framework catching up in many regards, and I think there have been other companies as well, other countries as well, that have put in some different frameworks. I think, in fact, India are also looking at summoning some of these IT companies or big tech companies to one of their parliamentary committees as well, Parliamentary Committee on Information Technology. So clearly, this instance of the last month is now letting these countries catch up and start to look at the options for remedying some of this stuff, I think.
Yeah. Reuven, I think you might be the last one. So if you've got a quick question, fire away. Just unmute yourself, please.
Just another quick one. Have you heard, I haven't heard news, but Brian Assange has been given a pardon in this state.
Is the question, has he, or are you saying he has?
I don't know. I'm asking.
I don't think he has. My carefully curated Twitter feed would tell me that, and my understanding is that he hasn't been. The suggestion is that the president had a reason for doing that, which related to his own saving his own skin in front of the Senate. I don't know if that's true or not, but my understanding is that he hasn't, although I think there is still time. So we will see what happens tomorrow, but at this stage, I don't believe so.
Okay. All right, we're coming up to time. Senator Antic, thank you so much for joining us. Wonderful discussion. David, I'll hand back to you for the final wrap up, please.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone, and thank you, our guest, Senator Alex Antic. I just add that one issue that I think that governments are going to come up against, and it's a pretty scary one that we saw displayed during the US election, and that is the absolute power of these companies being displayed. It'll be an interesting contest to see if the Polish law can stand, to see how India tackles it, how other advocates for free expression manage it. And of course, in Australia, I have no doubt that when the committee is formed, hopefully it will be, and the inquiry is underway, there'll be all sorts of threats. The sky is going to fall and Australia will be put at disadvantage, but time will tell. This just remains now to foreshadow what's happening next week. And next week, if you're interested in political correctness, it's probably a week to avoid. We have Ross Cameron as guest next week on the subject of Prospective Issues 2021. We've asked Ross to give some thought as to what might be the challenges during 2021. Ross is a terrific friend of Israel and the Jewish community, and in fact has received an international award for, in 2018, being one of the top 100 influencers on Jewish life, and we'll play the video clip that resulted in that award. So Ross is next week. And finally, everyone here, 3 things we need you to do to support AJA. If you're not yet liking and following the AJA Facebook page, that is the best forum for our news and views on a daily basis. Join the email list, simply send your name to office@jewishassociation.org.au, and of course we need financial support as well, and you can apply via the website for membership, and there's a facility there to donate as well. So thank you again, Alex.
Okay.
Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. It's you're a breath of fresh air, and we wish you all the best. And we're right behind you. Okay, everybody, that's it for this evening. We look forward to joining you all next week at the same time. So from all of us here, it's good night to you all. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.